is back at it on the Danny Jones podcast, talking about Jesus, obviously. Ammon tries to paint a pretty wild picture about Jesus. If none of you have heard of him, he is supposedly some kind of classicist historian of some sort, but a lot of people are really unsure of his expertise, which you will probably see why here in just a moment. And if you've never heard of the guy, you are going to be completely perplexed by his claims here. So let's just jump into it. My first thing I would like to say, though, is how there really is no scholars that agree with anything he says. So I want to put that first, just so people understand the amount of craziness we're dealing with here. But a lot of people have been convinced by his arguments. He's really built up a large following of this. So let me just go ahead and jump right into his exact views. Ammon Hilman thinks particularly the passage of Jesus being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. He thinks this is referring not to Jesus being arrested for his claims and his other actions, but he thinks that this has to do with Jesus committing some kind of crime of pedophilia and drug abuse. The drug abuse comes from him literally. This is going to sound wild. He is literally getting the drug off of this young kid. He thinks the young boy mentioned in Mark 14 at the arrest is the boy that Jesus literally molests to get it off of him, if I were to put it in a light way for YouTube. But basically Jesus was just a part of this weird cultish pedo stuff, and that's why he ends up getting arrested. And the reason why Jesus is so distressed later on is because of this drug that he got off. So I think it's a good thing to read the passage. That's always a good place to start. But the problem is Jesus is distressed not because of some kind of drug, but he does this right after speaking with Peter, James, and John in the story. It's the only 4 people in the story. Jesus goes on to pray and returns to Peter sleeping. The young man is not here, or the young boy, if you were to look at that view. So, but verse 43 of Mark 14. This is where it starts with Judas coming with a group of people with swords and clubs to capture Jesus. But the text states that someone drew the sword. So, right before this moment, it was just Jesus and 3 other followers. The young man who appears in verse 51 has also arrived with the crowd. Also, the Greek word for this, the young man, is not childlike. It's not a small kid, as Ammon is trying to say. It's the same Greek word that's used of the rich young ruler of Matthew chapter 19, when the young ruler asked Jesus, "What must I do to inherit salvation, eternal life?" And this is obviously not some adolescent child. This is a rich young ruler. So this is probably a 17, 18-year-old at this point, and we're probably dealing with likewise in this event too. But this, age can vary and whatnot. But Jesus even responds by this with the group of people with the swords. And he says, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords to capture me?" And some translations will even say, "as a robber." You come to capture me as if I'm a robber, a criminal. This is specifically the ESV that states that. And this gives us context on how the word is being used. A robber is someone who would be arrested with swords, some kind of criminal. So Jesus he even responds to this right after this. He says, "Every day I was in the temple, and you did not arrest me." And then by verse 50, it states that everybody leaves Jesus. They've all ran away. So verse 51 first introduces the young man, again, who was probably some teenager, who has appeared with the big crowd to arrest Jesus. He was not a part of the story before this. He was not in the garden. So when it says in verse 51 that he was following Jesus, it uses the active voice of the verb in a tense form called the imperfect. Hilman's reading of this passage is against all of Greek literature. Hilman tries to use the passive voice instead of the active voice, as he says it as was assigned to him instead of following him. This is semantically untenable. It makes absolutely no sense to read it this way. And you don't need to be an expert in Greek to know this. This is something you can just do with a basic Google search on some kind of lexicon like the LSJ or the BDAG. So don't take my word for it. Take a look at those resources if you guys would like. And just like and subscribe for more content like this.